The first in a series of new modules published by TSR's UK division in 1981, The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh is often considered one of the best adventures for D&D ever written. I'm going to talk about the adventure and how I run it for my games today on Daddy Roll the One. Please help support Daddy Roll the One by visiting my shop to buy a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, tote bag, or notebook. I have a bunch of new designs, including the new D10 and D12 patent designs to join the patent designs for the D4, D8, and D20 that I already had. So please head over to the shop. There's a link in the show notes below, and thank you so much for your support. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin. This is another video in my series on Dungeon Master advice, but it's also going to cover history as I talk about the release of the U series of modules, particularly focusing on U1, released by TSR's UK division in 1981. And there was a relationship at that time, or just previous to this, between TSR and Games Workshop, actually, where Games Workshop was responsible for distributing and then later on even doing some printing of Dungeons and Dragons and other TSR products in the UK. And to learn more about that history, you're going to want to check out my video on the Fiend Folio Advanced Dungeons and Dragons hardback book that also discusses the relationship between TSR and Games Workshop, how that relationship eventually dissolved and then led to the formation of TSR UK, which again was responsible for publishing this particular module and the whole series. There were 3 in this particular series. So you might also be interested in my video on the history of the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay game, as that also does discuss a little bit about TSR's relationship with Games Workshop, which was at the dawn of the hobby, like they were kind of connected. And at a certain point, Gary Gygax says, later on, that he was actually interested in wanting to purchase Games Workshop, but the forces that be on the board at TSR decided not to let that purchase go forward. If you like that historical kind of content about the history of early tabletop role-playing games and Dungeons and Dragons, like I was talking about the history of TSR and its relationship with Games Workshop and then how that eventually became TSR UK, please make sure to like the video and leave a comment on it and subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when I upload new videos. So that's really key because the YouTube algorithm is pretty vicious and it's really looking for how many people watch a video like almost immediately after it is published and how many people like it, watch it and then comment on it. So if there's any way that you can help out the channel by doing that right when a video posts, I would really, really appreciate it because it just helps so much. So I'm going to be talking about how I kind of run this module, how I change it, and why I liked it so much. So when this module came out, it was 1981. Now, I didn't start playing D&D until the fall of 81, and I didn't play through this adventure. It probably was around 83 or 84. So, but at that time, I was really enamored, I'll say, with just pop culture things that were coming out of the UK. So particularly music. So things like The Clash and Sex Pistols, and then like The Police was huge during this time. So 83, which is again around the time I would have been playing this, that was sort of The Police's swan song record, Synchronicity. And it was everywhere, right? And so many top 10 songs coming off of that album. And then things like the English Beat and Madness and the music, it was just so different. And I just thought anything coming out of the UK was super cool. I had seen the Fiend Folio. My friend had it, let me borrow it all the time. And then when he didn't let me borrow it, I would check it out from our library until someone basically checked it out and never returned it. And so I had kind of been a little bit exposed to how the UK approached things with Dungeons and Dragons with that Fiend Folio, and it was different. It was different than what we were seeing. I was aware of White Dwarf existing, although I'd never seen an issue. at the time, like our local stores didn't carry it. But when I was playing through this and then learned that this was coming from the UK, I was so excited because it's very different. It's the aesthetic, the vibe, whatever you want to call it, and the way that this is presented was very different from some of the other adventures that were being published around this time by the United States version of TSR. So this is U1, The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh. The U stands for underwater, and it's part of a trilogy that goes to U2, The Danger at Dunwater, and then it wraps up with U3, The Final Enemy. Now, I'm not going to really be talking about these two that much because what I'm really talking about is how I run this particular module, specifically relating to how I'm doing it in right now, and we're still going through it for my daughter's game. Okay, so, but there's a lot of kind of like really cool things in this. Now, I will say it is called The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh, so that gives you a sense that there's some kind of mystery involved here. So if you haven't played through this before and you have any kind of interest in doing so, I guess you might want to stop watching the video because I am going to talk a little bit about what the secret is. And, this module's been out there forever. So, most old timers would already kind of know that. But, if you're new and this is something that's of interest to you, what you can do is send this video to your dungeon master of choice, ask them if they'll run this for you and to watch the video to get some tips on how to run it. Okay, so this is by Dave J. Brown and Don Turnbull. It's for an adventure for character levels 1 through 3. So Dave J. Brown, basically, he's a British game designer. Not just. It's just the reason I say that is because there's not a ton of information out there that I can find about him other than him working on this adventure and some other adventures that UK published. Very specifically, there's another line of adventure modules published by TSR UK called the UK series. And Dave J. Brown writes and develops UK1, which was the Crystal Cave, I think it was. I have it in my collection. I should have pulled it off the shelf. And then, he works on The Danger at Dunwater as well with Don Turnbull and The Final Enemy. So works on that series. So those are kind of like his big claims to fame as far as game design from what I've been able to find out. So if anybody knows extra about Dave Brown, I would love to know, because as you know, I try to share as much as I can about these designers that, I just want to make sure that they're not forgotten and that we are remembering them for their contributions to our hobby. Now, Don Turnbull, we did talk about before when I went over my video on the Fiend Folio, but the short version is that, he was a war gamer and a mathematician, and he had published a zine that covered the diplomacy game. And when that zine went out of business, it was called Albion. Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone created another zine called Alan Weasel, and they ended up sending it to all the people who had subscribed to Albion magazine, and then that, they got the list for Albion, and then Albion went away, and Alan Weasel eventually is going to morph into what's called White Dwarf. And Don Turnbull wrote articles for Alan Weasel and White Dwarf, eventually takes over a common White Dwarf called the Fiend Factory, which is a collection of monsters contributed for Dungeons and Dragons by the readership of White Dwarf, and those monsters eventually get incorporated into the Fiend Folio. TSR had a deal with Games Workshop to publish the Fiend Folio in 1979, so the book was written and done by then. But then the relationship between TSR and Games Workshop, again, I mentioned, it kind of devolves, it goes away. And so TSR UK is created. Don Turnbull is put in charge of TSR UK by Gary Gygax, and Fiend Folio is then published in 1981. So that's Don Turnbull. He unfortunately died a while ago, so it was very sad. But a big legacy of contributing to the popularity of not just Dungeons and Dragons, but role-playing games in general in the UK, and did quite a bit of work again on these adventures. Okay, so this is, it's your standard sort of adventure for the time. It's got the map with like, the folder map. And so what you did back then was you put this up like this as the DM, and then this was like your screen. Okay. So the map in here has a map of the haunted house with caves underneath. a map of the Sea Ghost, which is kind of like part 2 of this adventure. The adventure is in 2 parts. So part 1 is the haunted house itself, and then part 2 is the Sea Ghost. So you have this cool map for the ship, which you can pretty much use this map if you wanted to. Anytime you need a ship in your game, your players probably aren't given a notice that it's similar. And then more of the haunted house map here for the different floors. Okay, and then you have this back cover art here. And that's your front cover art there. So I played through this adventure when I was a kid, and I have just super fond memories of it. It was one of the first ones that I played through. We did go through Keep on the Borderlands when I was a kid. And then, we played some other things. I remember playing through the Giant series. We didn't always play things in order, and a lot of times we just create new characters for whatever adventures was. I remember for this particular one, I had a dwarf fighter thief. That was my character for Advanced D&D, and I used him for quite a few different adventures along the way. So when I was starting the campaign for my daughter, I wasn't kind of sure where they were going to start out. And I didn't want to really force them into this. I was hoping that they would go through Keep on the Borderlands, but I wanted to leave it a little bit open. And so what I did was had them start in a village. And that was kind of their test. I've talked about this before on the very first episode of my playlist on my DM advice. I talked about how that first session was basically getting them used to like rolling the dice and what to look for and like rolling high, this kind of thing, and like, when to use your attributes and that kind of stuff. And then they're at the end of that adventure, of that session, that very first session, I told them that like basically they could go in 4 different directions. So they could go north. So this was their little town that they were in. They could go north, south, east, or west. And then I had made notes to myself. I didn't show them this map of like what was where. And now I did end up changing this a little bit. So here I put that Dunsmith was to the south, and I eventually moved that to be to the west. It was kind of more like southwest, but whatever. And then Orlane, you see here, was to the north. And then I ended up putting Saltmarsh to the south. And then this town over here, I called Oceanschweig, but it was on the borders of this, like the frontier of this kingdom, the empire. Okay, so if you kind of know your D&D history and your different names of different things, each one of these was leading to like a different adventure. So the one you might not be familiar with is this one, the Scenic Dunsmith. So this is not an old school adventure. This is what you'd call an OSR, old school Renaissance or old school revival adventure, written for Lamentations of the Flame Princess. System to me doesn't matter as much as like ideas. It's old school anyway, so it's kind of interchangeable with BX D&D, which is what I'm running. I talked a little bit more about this, and I did a review on sort of like what is the OSR, and so you can see that link up here where I go more into detail on this adventure. And then Orlane was for this adventure. This is N1, Cult of the Reptile God, against the Cult of the Reptile God. And this, again, is for character levels 1 through 3. So that was the idea. Each one of these was going to lead to an adventure for 1 through 3. And then we already saw that Saltmarsh is for 1 through 3. And then, of course, B2, Keep on the Borderlands, that was going to be the one that on the far west of the front, or the far east, the frontier of this giant empire, on like the Borderlands, obviously, and for levels 1 through 3. So I told them, pick where you want to go, and they ended up deciding to go east, and so they did go through this. And I have talked about this several times about the different caves in here and how I run them and that kind of thing with this particular adventure. However, I didn't want to forget that they had options to go to these other places, and I wanted to kind of make sure that they remembered that those options were available. So you've seen before where I talk about like my message board, this idea. I got this from Professor and Dungeon Master on Dungeon Craft channel, but I have this message board that would be found in like the tavern that they visit, and I changed the notes like all the time. A bunch of my notes have fallen off from here. I just need to put them back on, and I try to keep it updated. But this was kind of like back when they were still in the town where the Keep on the Borderlands was located. And I had a bunch of these different notes, and one of the notes that I put on here, and I couldn't find it, I think my players kept it with them, but one of the notes was that the head of like the Merchants Guild was the guy that they knew, and again, I took this name from the Dungeon Craft channel, was Ulrich von Munchberger. And they had met him before and kind of helped him out of a jam. And so he had kind of, created a relationship with the characters. And that was sort of like my way to introduce leads if I needed them or wanted them to do something. He would like ask them to come meet with him and then say, hey, I need help with such and such. And one of the things that he had left on the message boards here in the tavern was a note mentioning that caravans were being attacked on the way to Saltmarsh. And so I mentioned the town name, by name, so that they would remember that they had heard of it before when they were trying to decide which way to go when they left their old village. And so caravans were being attacked. It was happening more than once. And this guy was looking for guards or people to kind of protect it, and then eventually he developed a relationship with one of the PCs, one of the players. I mentioned I like to have an NPC for each player that's like specific to them, that they can make sure that they have conversations with them. And so he developed a relationship with this PC who was an elf, and he had somehow had the idea that she was the leader of the party. She really wasn't. That was my idea as the DM, to kind of bring her out of her shell a little bit and give her a chance to talk more. And he asked her if she could get her compatriots to help guard one of his caravans. So the player agreed that, we'll look into it. And the guy, Munchberger, he was like, the caravan's not leaving for a while, but I'd like to have some experienced people to help guard this caravan because it's been attacked before, and I've lost like my shipments, and that was a big deal to him or whatever. So he was being a little bit manipulative. She didn't really know that. They kind of trusted this guy, and that was on purpose. I tried to play him that way, but a lot of the NPCs in my world, I'm sure in yours as well, have like ulterior motives. So, but I was trying to like slowly kind of like start setting the stage and start, foreshadowing, like, if you want to go to Saltmarsh, like, what are some of the things that are going on there? And so one of the things is like these caravans are being attacked, and why is that happening, kind of thing. The other thing that happened was that Munchberger started telling some stories, and they didn't know it was actually coming from him, but little by little rumors start spreading throughout the keep that there's this town far away to the south on the coast by the sea, and there's rumored to be like a haunted house there. And that was going to be the haunted house from the Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh. Again, the characters don't know this because they don't know the story of this adventure. And that's one of the things about this adventure that I really like, in that it is, it's different from like a standard dungeon crawl. So this one was very open-ended. Keep on the Borderlands, very, very open-ended. Leaves a lot up for the DM to kind of do and figure out like why things work the way that they work. And then you have like your really story-based stuff that's going to come out a few years after this, like a Dragonlance or a Ravenloft, something like that. That's like all about the story, right? This sits in this like really sweet spot in between where it's still open-ended. It's very flexible. It allows a lot of room for DM creation and interpretation, but there is like this mystery and this puzzle that the characters are trying to solve and figure out. And so it's more than just go into the caves and clear them out of all the monsters of chaos, right? There's a little bit more complexity to this one. And I really do think that's why it's kind of been rated so high, because it sort of fits in that sweet spot between being a little bit sandbox-like, but also having enough of a story without being like, a linear railroad story, right? So one of the big reasons why I like this particular one. So and I was wanting to, again, provide information to the characters about like some things that they might want to, think about in terms of like, do they want to go to Saltmarsh? Now, one of the things was like, I didn't do a lot of that with this adventure because I felt like the way that I ran Keep on the Borderlands was very similar to kind of the structure of this adventure. There's a lot of kind of similar sort of ties between these two, at least I think. And so I sort of felt like this would feel a little bit repetitious if I were to run it. And there's nothing wrong with this adventure. I like it a lot. It's great. I just felt like it was a little too close to what I was doing with this one. So I didn't drop a lot of hints about them maybe wanting to go north to where this was located on my map, right? I did do a few with this one, but one of the things that I hadn't thought about when I picked this to put as one of the locations that my player characters might want to go, I wasn't really thinking about my daughter's severe fear and dread of spiders. And there's essentially a spider cult in this particular adventure. And it's a huge part of this. And it would be very difficult to strip out and replace it with something else. You could, but I think it would lose a lot. And, I know there's a lot of people out there that just think that like, oh, D&D is supposed to make you scared and just, that doesn't matter. Like whatever. It does matter. It's my daughter. She has PTSD that manifested as a fear of spiders. Her PTSD was not caused by spiders, but that's how it manifested. We've been through therapy with this, so it is a big deal to her. And I'm not going to force her to live through something in a D&D game just because I want her to face spiders. That's ridiculous. So I love this adventure, and I really am hoping to run it one day. I haven't had a chance to run it yet. I've only read it. I'm just going to have to do it for a different group, not for my daughter. So in any event, most of the hints that I were dropping were about playing through the Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh. So the other thing that I wanted to do with this is really fun because the town that it takes place in, Saltmarsh, it basically tells you it's sort of like your traditional kind of like English fishing town. It talks about it a little bit here and how to like set up the town. And I thought that was a really cool sort of like approach to this because it was different. It was different than some of the other towns, because again, it had that sort of UK feel, which I told you I was really excited about at the time. So, but I wanted to change it a little bit and make it sort of like fit more in with my world and sort of the vibe that I like to go for. If you follow my blog at all, or if you've seen some of the posts I've done on social media, I'm really into kind of like weird fantasy, but not gonzo weird. Weird where I don't know how quite to describe it, but it's sort of like, I guess some people would call it like vanilla fantasy or generic fantasy, but that ends up standing out because you add in some of these like weird elements. And if you do it judiciously and in the right way, the weird stuff becomes really weird and creepy because you're not used to it. If it's weird all the time, then it becomes generic again and that's irrelevant. But if you dash it in here and there, it stands against, your traditional fantasy. It's one of the reasons why I like to use like humans or, demi-human monsters and brigands and cults and things like that much more often than monsters. I don't like to have ecologies or like entire species of monsters necessarily. Humanoids are fine. That's a little bit different, like goblins and orcs and things like that. But like, as an example, the characters in my daughter's group fought an owlbear in here, because there is an owlbear in here, okay? They had never seen an owlbear before, and the reason they never seen one is because they don't exist. That was the only one. In my world, that was the only owlbear, and it was a creation that went wrong from a goblin alchemist that I put in this adventure. He did experiments, natural experiments on animals, and ended up creating a mutant that was a cross between an owl and a bear. So that was the only one in existence, except it had some eggs. So it was a female, and at some point it had somehow encountered probably a large male bear and had procreated with it, and it had 3 eggs. And so they killed the owlbear, not realizing it was the only one in existence, but it was attacking them. It was self-defense. And they took the eggs and they sold one, and they gave one away to the witch, and then they gave one to the owner of the bar or the tavern, who had asked them, like, who was falling on hard times and wanted a little something to kind of like goose up his business. And so they brought in the head of the owlbear that he mounted above the bar, and then his wife cooked one of the eggs and had like all the fancy people in town come and have this like nice dinner. So anyway, but to me, having that be the singular owlbear in the world, and they're never going to see another one, makes that encounter so much more memorable and stand out than if you just encounter them all the time. All right, so I wanted to change this and have this be a little bit more in that vein, where it was a little bit like darker, a little bit grimmer. And so I wanted to put sort of like a, Cthulhu, Lovecraftian or Clark Ashton Smith, or like A. Merritt, sort of like those kind of, again, like that weird fiction twist to this. And so I ended up changing sort of like what the main thing of is this adventure. So this is the part where, again, if you're a player in this, you're going to not want to listen to this, or if you want to play in this. The main part of this adventure is that there's a group of brigands who are like smugglers, essentially. They're smugglers who are making the house appear haunted so that people stay away from it because they use it as their base of operations. And underneath this house, this mansion, there are caves that go out to the sea that they use for access to their ship, which is why there's that map of the ship in here. And this is how they're smuggling their goods. They bring them in, the caves underneath this mansion, and then this is like their base of operations of how they distribute things. And so they want to keep people away, so they've designed some traps, and they're partnering with like an illusionist and stuff to kind of create it like there's ghosts here, okay? And they spread rumors about the place being haunted. So I wanted to kind of to change that. Now, one of the things that is in here as well is that there's a group of lizard men who are working with these smugglers because the lizard men want weapons, and the smugglers bring them weapons in exchange for other things. And then eventually, it goes on into this whole thing where you've got like mermaids and Locatha and all those kinds of different creatures and stuff. I didn't want to do any of that. So I have no idea if my group is ever going to go through U2 and U3. I suspect not, partly just because they're unfortunately getting older, and I'm not sure how much longer I'm going to be able to run this game for them. They're 15 now. They were like not even quite 11 when we started. And so I'm gathering that as they get older and they start driving and they have, school activities and stuff in high school, they're all in high school now. And, they were when we started, they were in 5th grade maybe they were starting 6th grade, I guess is when we started, but neither here nor there. So I don't know that we're going to go through that. So anyway, I wanted to change this to fit in more with like what I had done in here, which was I was really kind of keen on the cult aspect of this in Cave K, which is where the, like the Temple of Evil or Temple of Chaos is, or whatever it's called in here. And so I decided to change the smugglers to cultists, and I changed the lizard men to deep ones. And the deep ones don't want weapons. They're basically just the lackeys of this cult. And so everything in here I changed to have that kind of vibe. Now, one of the things that I've done, and I post this on social media from time to time, is descriptive adjectives or descriptive words used by the different authors from Appendix N in the 1979 Dungeons Master's Guide for Advanced D&D. So if you go onto like my Instagram and scroll back through the feed, you'll see these lists of like descriptive words from these different authors. And I use that to kind of help put that sort of tone on here. So when you use different words, when you're describing things, it gives it a little bit more of that kind of feel that I wanted, rather than just repeating like it's dark or it's eerie or whatever. You start to use like these a little bit heavier words. I'll put some of them up here on the screen so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. But it helps with the descriptions. And then I basically went through and I rewrote all of the room descriptions in here in the haunted house itself, to have that sort of vibe to it. So, I talk a lot about like they'll hear noises in the walls of like, rats scratching and things like that. And it's a subtle change that really fits in with this being a haunted house, but it's like the way that you describe it, they were getting really creeped out and they were very scared to like move through the house because they just knew something was wrong. It felt wrong. So another thing that I do a lot is I talk about things that just make you feel uneasy. And so things like angles being wrong, as an example. And so one of the things that I did as they were leaving, the keep, and they were decided, so they went through Cave K and they fought this creature that was, the worm that walks. Again, I stole that from Dungeon Craft. and they killed it, but then it started to reform in front of them. And it was only going to reform once. And if they'd killed it a second time, it would have been gone. But they freaked out because, you know, they had no context to know that it wasn't going to just keep coming back over and over. And they had at this point lost, I think, all of the NPC retainers and hirelings that they had brought with them. And one of their characters had been knocked unconscious and brought back, but like barely had like 1 hit point, and you know, was going to develop some kind of scar from the wounds. And the cleric was out of healing spells. So they ran from Cave K, and they decided we need to get out. And so I talked a little bit about this before in my summary of the adventures when they were leaving the keep on the Borderlands. So one of the things I mentioned in the keep was that there was a guild house there, and that the PCs needed to make composure checks due to the unnatural angles that they encountered. This guy that they knew was in there, and he was doing some crazy stuff. It was pretty bad. I forget exactly what it was, but I think he'd like clawed his eyes out because he couldn't stand the sight of basically, it was like an elder god, like a Cthulhu type thing. And he couldn't look at it anymore, but he wanted to be able to hear it, and so he'd clawed his eyes out. And so that was a big deal for them. And so, but it says when they're leaving the guild, they were intercepted by Ulrich. So Ulrich von Munchberger, that guild guy I told you about, the merchant. And he said, if you want to leave, you have to do it now. The city's almost under lockdown. Things were going crazy at this point in time. And so he's like, I'll run interference with the Castellan about the caves and like what had happened. And he says, please accompany my caravan to Saltmarsh, but don't look inside. So the thing was, he was actually trying to get rid of the PCs. They had done some work in the caves, but what they had found there was a vein of this stuff called, in my game, Moonstone. And the cleric player in my game, which is played by the only dad player, he was a priest of the god that likes Moonstone. And so they was investigating a little too much, but you can use Moonstone in this campaign to like make hallucinogenic drugs, which is what Munchberger wants, because that's where the money is. So that's what's in this caravan, which is why it was attacked, because people knew that that's what's in there. So he just wants guards to keep the Moonstone intact. He's taking it to Saltmarsh, where it's going to be refined by an alchemist there and turned into this hallucinogenic drug called Moonsnow that's then going to be sold, you know, throughout the region. Okay, so and he wants the PCs out of the keep area and the caves because there's a rival adventuring group called the Executioners, and they're not very nice people. And he is going to hire the executioners to go and finish up what the PCs didn't do, which is clean out the rest of the caves. Basically just like, because the PCs, when my players went through the caves, they were making deals with some of the different factions in here, like some of the different monsters, to kind of like, you know, have a little like detente where they weren't fighting each other, but, you know, they wouldn't harm the PCs, and they would allow the PCs safe passage, because my players didn't go in here to clear out the caves. That wasn't the intent. They were just exploring and, you know, looking for things. I would give them like missions to like, oh, the witch lost her wand there. Can you go find it? Like this kind of thing. Right. And so they didn't have an interest in trying to like, you know, mow down everybody, but Munchberger was going to hire the executioners to go do that and then take over the caves so that he could mine this Moonstone, because there's a vein of it. And Moonstone in this game it's basically, it's like an asteroidal rock that just has like mutant, you know, magic essentially. Okay, so he sent them away, and so that's why they left. And so they left and decided to go to Saltmarsh. And so then I was like, well, I need some stuff along the way to kind of like, you know, foreshadow what's going to happen. So I created some lists of some road encounters that might happen on the way to Saltmarsh, and they were, you know, intended to be creepy. Now, a lot of these I've gotten from other sources, usually from like, you know, old school Renaissance type books. I've talked about like Into the Weird and Wild before. There's one called, I think, Woodfall. There's a few different ones that I really like for their like random encounters or just different ideas. And so a lot of these are from there. But I had some things like, you know, they were encountering refugee families from the keep. Well, they could have. They didn't roll that. They did get the rain where they got stuck and it put their torches to be unusable. So that I remember that one. And then they came across an abandoned fishing village. And it says there are strange esoteric symbols painted on some of the doors. Footprints can be seen leaving these buildings. So that was on the way to Saltmarsh. So I was starting to kind of like little by little kind of foreshadow, like, what are some of the things you might see once you get to Saltmarsh. They came across, or they could have come across, some maroon sailors. So all these were random, and so obviously they didn't go through all of these. But I was trying to like kind of, put the theme forward. So, the maroon sailors claim they have come ashore because they heard an irresistible song, or the captain went mad, or they swam after the ship was destroyed by an enemy fleet, or the crew fell victim to plague. And then I put 50% chance they're lying. So that never ended up happening. They didn't encounter those guys, but they could have. And then I would have role played out a little bit to tell them a little bit more about Saltmarsh. But like just getting to the town and talking about how it was made, and the different gates and the tax that they had to pay. And then I talked about, there's a Merchants Guild Hall, which is a 3-story building. So one of the things that I did in this book, so this is my book that I kickstarted earlier this summer. I know a lot of people have been asking about this. So if you contributed to the Kickstarter at the PDF level, you should already have your email to download the PDF, whether it is the parchment style background or the plain white. This was my test run copy of the POD soft cover. And it didn't work because the page layout was wrong. So it was off by a page, which meant none of my spreads worked the way that they were supposed to. So I finally got that fixed after we figured out what the problem was. And then I've ordered another test copy of this. And then once that gets sent to me, if it's correct, then I can finally send that out and then order all the rest of the test copies. So the way it works with Drive-Thru-RPG, you can't sell things until you've ordered a test copy. So because I have I have 4 different versions. I have a soft cover plain background and soft cover parchment, and then I have a hardcover plain and hardcover parchment. So I have to order all 4, but I just ordered one to make sure that it worked. So I'm not paying for 4 things that didn't work. And the other thing Drive-Thru-RPG doesn't let you do is once you upload your files, they don't have any system where you can view and see what it's going to look like before you order a print run. So your only way to know if it looks the way it's supposed to is to just blindly order a print run and hope, or a print copy, and hope that it printed correctly. And this one didn't. But what I wanted to show you is one of the things that you'll eventually see in here when you get this is that I have a thing on a guild hall. And so there's like a fun map in here, and then like different ideas for each floor and like what's found there. And so that's an idea. If you ever need a guild hall, you could pick this up. Eventually the PDF and the POD will be for sale on Drive-Thru, but I can't do that until I've sent it to my backers. So, but I had a Merchants Guild Hall here, and I kind of patterned off of the one that I used in my book here. The other thing that you see when you are reading through The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh is that it tells you that basically you have to create the town. So it says the little town of Saltmarsh plays a pivotal role in all, it says all 4 adventures, the 2 presented here, and then those in U2 and U3. And then it talks about the town council encouraging the party to undertake various adventures. And it says if there's to be an adequate background to the series, the DM is recommended to prepare the town quite thoroughly. And then it tells you, you've got to name the people on the town council, other local citizens. You have to create them, draw a map of the town, decide where the characters are going to stay and where they're going to rest in between adventures, decide where to locate the town's places of worship and which deities worship there. So it tells you how to do that. It says you can use the Dungeon Master's Guide. So I decided to just, be lazy. But one of my favorite books from the 3.5 edition of Dungeons and Dragons is, and I've talked about this before, but it's the Dungeon Master's Guide 2. And one of the things that they put in this book is a detailed town of Saltmarsh. So it's the premise is that it's telling you how to build a town, right? And so, but in doing so, it gives you a full example, and it has NPCs and names and the guild leaders and what life is like in Saltmarsh. And then there's a map and, what all the different buildings are. And then it has all these different little adventure hooks that are in here. And I was like, well, why, recreate the wheel? This has been done. All I need to do is take this, but then, again, change it to incorporate my Cthulhu type cult that I have in here, the deep ones, strip out some of the stuff that doesn't fit that. But I left a lot of it in here. And that is how I sort of like made my town. That's how I did Saltmarsh. So I highly recommend, if you can, this shouldn't be that expensive. I mean, it's not one of the top books of 3.5 that people would be after. It's not one of the core books. You can also probably, I'm assuming, find it as a PDF, maybe on DM's Guild or whatever, So, but if you're going to be running Saltmarsh, I would recommend picking this up just for that chapter. I mean, it's pretty, and the map. I mean, the map is pretty helpful, which is the map that I ended up using here in my book. And so then I had like these different, town council members. Now I ended up writing these names like this, but I've changed them because these are names right out of 3.5 and they just don't quite fit my world. And so I've ended up changing a lot of these, but at the time I put them in here like this. But you can see I made that like this guy was a cultist. And so I talked about like, his goals were to expand the cults, and like every one of these has like a different goal and like a different little personality quirk to kind of help me role play them at the table. So that's partly how I sort of changed Saltmarsh. And then I had rumors like, there's rumors of like weird fishmen that was started by some sailors, and then the captain went mad and sailed into the storm, and they claimed to have seen a forgotten ancient city with pictographs depicting a race of fishmen and a huge cosmic being, but they're crazy and nobody believes them. So those were actually the sailors that I talked about from before, but this rumor did come up again, and they heard that. And there was a park here that was overtaken by frogs. And again, it was trying to go for that creepy nature. That actually came out of this. I changed it a little bit, but this idea that like there's things happening in this town that are a little bit different and a little bit creepy, again, a little bit weird, like having a park overrun by these frogs and nobody knows where they came from. And it's to the point where it's creeping people out. And, so my characters went and like took care of that. But I had all these rumors. Now, another thing that I did, I meant to grab this book off of my shelf, but there's a story that one of my friends gave me years ago, and it is called Baltimore, or The Steadfast Tin Soldier and the Vampire. So, or it's something to the akin to that. And the premise of the story, it's like a gothic ghost story that takes place right after World War I, and the main character is an aristocratic British, lord, minor, but he is, that went off to war to fight. And I guess spoiler alert if you want to read this book, but partly it's in the title because it talks about the vampires. So he's lying on a field after battle, and all the soldiers are dead except him. He didn't die, but he's very close to death. And as the sun sets, he hears this noise of flapping wings, and it turns out that there is a coven of vampires, or whatever group of vampires is called, a den, I don't know. But they come and they're feeding on these bodies to slake their thirst. And this guy is alive, and he realizes what's happening, and he freaks out, and he ends up killing one of the vampires. And that sets off this war, because they were sort of like, we were content to leave you guys alone, but you just killed one of us. And so now the war is on. And so they're hunting this guy, and they are after him. And so he brings together a group of people, friends that he's known. And the story is told as that there's this like little tiny like tavern in this rainy village. It's very atmospheric, like the descriptions and stuff. I pulled so much stuff from that book in the way that I described Saltmarsh. It's a highly descriptive and very evocative language that's used to describe these little tiny towns and villages and the inn. And he brings together three people that he's known from his past to basically tell them what's going on and that he needs their help to defeat these vampires. Okay, so I took those three characters, the three people that he meets. It's a doctor, a sea captain, and another lord. And I changed the doctor to be a woman because all of my players except one are women. And so I want them to see representation in the game. But other than that, I basically pulled them right out of that story. They've never read it, but they were easily slotted into this game. And so there's people that are there, Demetrios, Lemuela, and Lord Childress II. And so and I changed his name from Baltimore to Harrington, and there's a reason why I did that. But so he's not there; he's late, and then it talks about but he was from a minor aristocratic family, so he went away to a war, and he came back, and all his family was dead, and his ancestral grounds were set ablaze. So that's another rumor that they would have heard. People have gone missing. Now, another part of the game of this adventure is that at a certain point in here, the characters go into part of the caves underneath the house, and they find a suit of magic armor, and like a body, but the armor's fine. And so I wanted to kind of like foreshadow like what that was and why they would have found that there. And so I created an NPC and a storyline. So one of the ways they heard about this was this rumor here says a Knight of the Ring has been seen in town. Their order has not been heard from in years. So some of these are just things that they're learning about as they're interacting with people at like the different taverns and inns throughout the town. So, I had a few different things, and not all these are things that are going to be followed up on. Okay. But the other thing that I had done was I'd mentioned people have gone missing around town, including children. Many of them missing are dwarves, elves, and halflings. Now that was actually related to the whole frog thing, but they did follow up on that. But they saw this note, that this knight had been seen. And then what happened is, and I don't have this note either, because again, I think my players took it, but, this girl advertised on the message board and said that like her dad was missing. And so, I have like all these different notes. So I had like, if you need work, this guy will carry almost anything. He's got a strong back and arm. So this is, for people, if they want to hire, if they wanted to hire like, retainers and stuff. This was like the barber surgeon and where to go to get healed. The meeting of the next town council, so that they know that's a thing that the council meets, and like, so they would know, if they want to go meet with the town council, they would know where everybody's going to be at that time. That's why I put this up there, if they wanted to keep note of when they were going to meet. Top coin paid for any body parts or skin samples of so-called fishmen sighted outside of town. And then, see this guy at the Alchemist Guild. So that's, again, kind of confirming or maybe adding to the rumor of like these weird fisherman creatures that, and they had seen some weird stuff on the way into town. This is a mom seeking work, opulent rooms available and where to get them. This was, reward for information regarding attacks of caravans from the province of Stadthof. So that's where, in my world, the Keep on the Borderlands was located. So this was confirming again that these caravans were being attacked on the way into town. And then this one, can't pay much, but would love someone to get rid of all the frogs in Frog Park. It's too noisy. So there's that. Now, this is the one that was really fun. So my daughter had the idea that because people were talking about missing children, and then they'd heard that this knight was in town, and they heard that his daughter had mentioned that he was missing. So she left a note on the board and said, someone missing, the Shadow Hunters, which is what they call themselves, their adventuring party. The Shadow Hunters are experts. Leave word at the Wicker Ram, which was the inn that they were staying. So they left that on the board at the end of one of the sessions. And then the next session they came back and they said, we want to go look at the board. And they went, and the note was gone. And they were like, someone took our note, and they were really upset because they thought that it was like someone else that didn't want competition. But what it was in my game was, it was this girl that I had created, an NPC that I called Constance. And she ended up being the one that was like looking for her dad. And I had her take the note and then go find my daughter's character and like hand it to her. And ask her, like, say, like, oh, or, are you one of the Shadow Hunters? Like, I found this note here. So, so it's here. Pages come out of my book, unfortunately. So, I have talked about this a few times, but I usually write my hand notes in this book first, and then I type them up and I glue them into this book. Because it's hard for me to read my writing during the game, and just having these little bullet points and stuff. And so, it's like bigger type I can refer to. Usually by the time I've typed it, cut it out, paste it in the book, and glanced at it, I usually don't have to look at it during the session because I've kind of at that point committed it to memory. But this girl Constance that I created, and she looks lost and confused. She's holding a small piece of paper and keeps approaching people, and she's looking for the shadow hunters. And she was the one that had their note. And then she said she wanted to hire them to find her dad. She came here with him a few months ago. He's a knight called Wilkin the Whisperer. He was looking for something about a ring. So he's a member of a knighthood group called the Order of the Ring that people thought had disappeared a long time ago, like generations ago, but somehow he's one of these guys. And then he said he was investigating some ghosts outside of town. He said he'd be back in the morning, but that was 2 weeks ago. And so I created her having skill with animals. Her dad had taught her how to handle his horse and things like that. And so that was a way for my characters. If you recall, 2 of the PCs in my game, their characters have wolf cubs that they travel with, and they needed a place to use that. And so what they said was they would go look for this girl's dad, and as payment, because she doesn't have any money, she could watch the wolf pups, feed them and take care of them and things like that. And so that was the arrangement that they made. So it ended up being perfect. I hadn't intended that when I invented that character, but it made sense. So I kind of just riffed on it during the session. So they go look for this girl's dad at the house, which is the excuse that they had to go to the house. That's why they went in the first place. But eventually they do find the body of this guy wearing this magic armor. And then they realized that must be that girl's dad. And they felt really, really bad. And so they actually didn't take the armor because they just felt like that was desecrating this guy. He was, supposedly a nice guy, and he died. And so they just left him there. Now, I think the intent was that at some point they want to go back and recover the body, but they have yet to do that. So that was kind of part of how I kind of wanted to foreshadow that, because again, if they just find a body in here and it's just magic armor, it's kind of meaningless. It's just oh, this guy died. Who is he? Oh, I don't know. Let's move on. But I had created this whole story ahead of time of who this guy was and that his daughter was in town. And so they really are looking after this girl now. They sort of feel responsible for her. And it's so, and I kind of like that. I like that they are looking at things that way, because it makes the NPCs just seem so much more real than just, again, finding a random dead body. Okay, so, but there's all these different places they could go. I added some supernatural fog into the town. And a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about in here is just the town, because it's near the sea. I talk about things like the wood is starting to rot from the sea air and the salt, and things that metal is rusty. So rusted signs. And I talked about the sign over the tavern that they go to. And it's actually foreshadowing again, as far as what's on the sign, and how, if they wanted to follow up on that, there could be some stuff there. But there was it was named after a ship that had gone adrift, I think. And the sign, it's a sailing ship with fish of various sizes, which some are unnaturally large, and they're jumping out, and the fish's eyes glow on the sign, and nobody can explain how that works. So again, it's all these little creepy little touches, but it's subtle. I don't hit them over the head with it. I just they mention that they're looking at the sign, because they're starting to get used to there's clues everywhere if they ask, but if they don't ask, I'm not going to tell them. And so they said, oh, well, what's on the sign? And I said, oh, it's this sailing ship with fish that are jumping out of the ship. And they thought that was really strange. And then I mentioned that the fish's eyes were glowing on the sign. And so they're well, there must be some kind of magic involved, but they don't know how that works. And nobody in town knows. A lot of people hadn't even noticed it before. So, it's little things like that. But, there's mold everywhere. And there's just this sense of there's the salt on the air. And they can hear on the wind, creaking ships. And, in the harbor or whatever, it's these little touches of how you describe things, so that it's not just oh, it's a haunted house, we have to go clean out and get rid of the ghosts or whatever. It becomes this immersive atmosphere of this town that seems it's kind of decrepit, and it's falling apart. And there's these weird fish creatures out there. And then these frogs took over this park. The other thing that I did in this particular one, because it did mention, and I got the idea because they mentioned in here, like, putting in the places of worship, and is there more than one, and what was it? So I mentioned that the cleric character played by the dad player, he belongs to a faith that is sort of like a fringe thing. And this was my chance, because I decided that this town was so far removed from the center part of the empire that, like, the hold that, the so-called great church has, was lower here. And so a lot of people in this part of town, or in this area of the world, they hold on to like these older gods. And so I had a lot of gods from like the world of Greyhawk, and I just stripped their names out, but I used their titles, because those titles are like pretty evocative. So I had like, there was like a traveler, which is like, the far traveler. I forget all the different gods, but like, yeah, I had the Lord of Storms, and that was just one. I forget what some of the other ones are. I put a bunch of other ones in here because I think I had to make them up on the fly, now that I remember correctly. But the cleric player was like, I'm going to go visit all these different temples and find out like what they're about, like what's the deal with them. And I was like, okay, that's totally, you should do that. And so, like, I think I had to on the fly come up with the names of all the gods that he was visiting and what they were all about. So, that's going to kind of, be my main part of talking about this. So they have explored the caves. They've explored the house. They met Ned the assassin. So, again, spoiler, I guess, but it's too late because I already told you that I was going to be revealing spoilers. So there is a plant in this house that was put there to attempt to assassinate the PCs if they got too close to the answer. Well, they did get too close, and there was an attack, and they were fighting each other, and then basically got to the point where my players are very big on like trying to parlay instead of kill. And so we did some reaction rolls, and Ned was outmatched. Like, by the time they figured out that he was trying to assassinate them, his assassination attempt botched. He failed his roll. And so now he's sort of at a disadvantage because it was 4 against 1. And so they work with him. He's like, look, there's stuff going on here that you guys don't know. It's all about the cult, and he knows, but he wants safe passage. So he's like, you let me go, and I promise that I will leave note for you where you're staying. And he knew where they were staying, so they know that he knows what he's talking about, because they had never met him before, but he knew exactly where they were staying in town, so they know that he's been keeping tabs on them. He's like, I'm going to leave note for you of like what's behind this. Okay, but I mentioned that his note is intercepted by an agent of this guy who is the head of the town council, but also like a cultist. And they eventually find his body when they return to town, and it's hanging upside down in a manner that was consistent with like a ritual type of killing. But I had mentioned that he had formed his thumb and forefinger into an L shape, except he's hanging upside down, so it doesn't look like an L, but he's making the L to be this guy's last name. So that's the mystery that they're working on right now. They've kind of moved out of the house and investigating the house. They went all the way through. They found the caves underneath. They found the opening caves to the sea. But they haven't put together the part that the ship is being used to smuggle goods into town for the use of the cult. They kind of let that go because now they're very interested in investigating the death of Ned and who killed him and why. And so that has nothing to do with its adventure, but it's just something that came up in the course of how I was like writing this. And so I created an agent for this guy. I said intercepted by an agent. And so I called her Corva Blackwood. I know it's kind of a cheesy name, but they don't know her name yet, so I might change it. But she's sort of like an assassin thief kind of character. And she's really in it for herself and to make money. But she could be someone that they could get information from if they can figure out that she's the one that took this guy's note. And I had some quotes here of how she kind of talks. It's very weird how she speaks about storms and shadows and things like this. And then I had my notes here on my atmosphere. So again, this is how I'm trying to kind of like evoke sort of like a Cthulhu type Lovecraftian atmosphere for this town. So I would talk about, like the oily lanterns, because it's like a seaside town, right? And then the air is thick and stale and it's mildewy, but you can always smell fish. There's unnatural angles to buildings and streets, but they don't really notice it. It just makes them uncomfortable. They really have to study to kind of figure that out. And then there's carvings of like, you know, eyes and tentacles and eldritch symbols if they look. So they will find these things, and they've seen them already on that house outside of town, that little fishing village. And they're starting to notice that those symbols are repeated here as well. And it makes them very uneasy because they don't know who to trust now, because a lot of these buildings are old and the people living there probably don't even know what these symbols are, but it gives the impression that like everybody might be in on this, right? And then they hear sounds and whispers, you know, on the air. They hear, you know, again, the gnawing rats, thumps coming from below wherever they're staying. And they'll see shadows on the floor, like moving on their own. So it's like little things like that to kind of add this atmosphere to make this like really spooky. I mean, there's already some spooky stuff in here, but it's very utilitarian. And people call this like the Scooby-Doo adventure, and it is kind of like that. So I'm trying to add to it with like more atmosphere to make it a lot more gloomy and creepy and weird. So again, just another example of like how I kind of try to add a little bit more atmosphere to some of the, you know, the different descriptions in the different rooms in here. So if you go to this room, it's called the skeleton's room. And the way that you're supposed to describe it is this room is dark. Light from a large room behind you spills faintly to show the room is only about 12 feet across, but to your left, there's only darkness. What little you can see is dingy and dirty. And there's basically 6 skeletons in there that were placed there by the alchemist to guard his private laboratory. And then the alchemist died, and so these skeletons have just been stuck in there. And so it says they'll be a little sluggish to make their initial reaction to the intrusion, but then they will attack later. So I completely kind of changed the way that this room was decorated. And so this is my description of the skeleton room. I said the smell is sickly sweet of incense, and there's a faint undertone of decay. And it feels unnaturally cold, but there's no windows down there, so there's no reason to. And then there's a sound of dripping water that's echoing, but there's no source from where that water is coming from. They just hear it. And then there's eerie shadows from the PC's torches, but there's nothing moving in the room. And then there's cobwebs, and then there's weird, unsettling constellations that are painted on the ceiling, but they don't reflect any actual constellations in the world. So this was of huge interest to the priest character, the cleric character, because you know, his god is kind of interested in that type of thing. And so he was really interested in like, why are these constellations not the ones that we normally see? All the characters thought that was weird. It kind of creeped them out, or at least the players. And then in the center of the room, I said there's a circular dais of black obsidian polished to a mirror-like sheen, and that the grotesque beauty that reflects the distorted form of 6 skeletons. And then I mentioned what the skeletons were doing. So I said 3 are kneeling as if in prayer or supplication. And then from my notes, I put those are cult acolytes. And then one looks like it was holding a book, which is missing, and she was the priestess. And then one is curled in the fetal position, and he's the lost scion of House Lassiter. So remember, Lassiter is the name of the guy who's on the town council, who was also in the cult. And then one is shielding itself with its arms. And so I acted it out like it was like crouching down and holding its arms in front of its face as like to block something. Okay. And so they were like, what the heck is going on? Like, this is weird. And they were really not happy with this. And then, and I knew what was going to happen was that the cleric character was going to try to turn these things, which is what he did. And then the ghost of the crypt scholar, which was shielding itself with his arms, whispered, the whispers promise power, but lead only to madness and oblivion. And then he says, the ritual failed. We were betrayed. Something stirred. We awakened it with our hubris. So that was that room. So they didn't actually fight the skeletons. They just slammed the door and moved on. They were like creeped out. And the skeletons had no interest in like fighting them. Again, the cleric turned most of them. So it was more about like the setting up, like there's weird stuff happening in this house. And, you know, I made this house like it's sitting on, you know, like ley line kind of things, like where, you know, like ancient rituals were held to like, you know, create a portal to like bring in the elder god, like that kind of thing, right? Your standard kind of Cthulhu stuff. But this particular room, I remember, was one of the ones that they very vividly remember because of how I wrote the description of the skeletons in that room. And to me, that was so much more flavorful than there's 6 skeletons in here that are slow to attack, but they'll attack you finally. And they were put there by the alchemist. I thought, no, let's do something a little bit more, you know, in tune with kind of like, how I run my games, right? And so another thing that happened here is that all the characters had a vision. And so then I passed these out to them. These were the notes. So it wasn't that. This was the note for Cora. So her vision was that she found herself trapped in a library filled with forbidden books and their pages whispering secrets that warp your mind and reveal unsettling truths about your own experience. What secret does it reveal about you? And then so my daughter wrote this and said, the secret was that my mom cheated on my dad with a gangster, and so my real dad is loaded and a criminal, and he is wanted in many areas. My last name is actually Bladel. I don't know. Coming from my real dad. But I had to change it because his family is well known and being hunted down. And then, of course, the obligatory LOL, that the way kids talk these days. So that was hers. I'm going to read a couple of the other ones. So Bartolo didn't have a vision. He was the only one. He got just save, and he made his saving throw, and everybody else failed. So he would have heard some weird whispers in an unknown tongue, promising forbidden knowledge in exchange for a terrible sacrifice. But he didn't go. So what I did was I handed them these things and said, "This is what happened. You tell me what happened, like what you think that this means." And so then Holly Short, the other elf, the cousin to Cora Netflix, had a vision from the witch. It says the vision manifests as a chilling whisper from the witch, warning you of the dangers ahead and the darkness consuming the mansion. The whisper hints at sacrifice need to escape, leaving you conflicted between loyalty and survival. What sacrifice does the vision show you'll need to make, and are you prepared to make it? And then she wrote, like, I can't be, and she calls so this is my daughter's best friend. The player of this is my daughter's best friend. They call each other Pookie. She says, like, I can't be Pookie's cousin with Cora anymore. And then she put a frowny face, and then she's like, oh, I don't like that. So she crossed out and she put, I lost my arm somehow. That was her vision. I don't know what she was thinking. And then just to kind of show you the difference. So all these players are the same age. They're all within, not even 4, like 2 to 3 months of age difference from each other, all born the same year within 2 to 3 months of each other. So just to show you the difference, this is my player. She plays the thief, who is the most into the role playing. So her thief's name is Augustus. And I said, Augustus finds herself trapped in a never-ending corridor of reflective surfaces, each showing distorted versions of herself and her companions. The visions reveal hidden darkness within each member, eroding trust and fueling paranoia. And then I asked her, what do you see? And she put, I see Holly giggling uncontrollably despite danger. That's a little bit of a dig, but it's funny because the player of Holly, when she gets nervous during the game, or when she gets bored, she will start cracking jokes. And so this was like very specifically written to address that. And then Cora, this is my daughter's character, Cora spinning in circles, unresponsive. Of the 4 players, my daughter is probably the one that is least likely to come up with an answer. If I say, what do you see, or what do you do, or what do you want to do? She usually lets others take the lead. And if I call on her specifically, sometimes she gets annoyed with me as her dad. And she'll just go, I don't know, or like, whatever. And so, I just thought that these notes were so insightful. Okay. And then Bartolo, this is the dad player, and he's the dad of the player who plays Holly. And she put, at an altar, casting a spell, selling his soul to the thrice great Kuhl. So she remembered the name of the god, which is the thrice great Kuhl, of this other player, and she's not even that player. Like, I just thought that was really interesting. She says, I see myself gambling my life away. Another version of me walks away as Alex, which was the character that this player used to play. She played a character named Alex and then decided to retire Alex and create Augustus. And if you follow these videos before, at a certain point, Alex returned. She played both characters for a little bit because it was based just like having an extra NPC. And then Alex ended up dying in the house that they were in the haunted house here. And so Alex lays dead on the floor. And she says, another version of me remembers Scabs. That was an NPC that they dealt with before. Scabs' family and Curfew Murphy dying. So other characters that they've met and become friends with along the way that have died. And then she said, also visions of Maddie. And I don't remember who Maddie is. Actually, I do. Maddie was Curfew Murphy's lieutenant. And it turned out that Maddie's probably hundreds of years old, but looks like she's a teenager. And they're not quite sure what to make of that. So again, I put these things in. These are visions that they had coming out of this room where the skeletons were. And and I really like doing this in my game. I like coming up with things where I ask the players, tell me what you feel, tell me what you think. I do it when I run combat with them. When they get like a critical hit or a critical fail. I mentioned this before, but I'll ask them what happens. I don't describe it for them. I ask them to describe it. What did you do? What move did you make? What is your failure if you rolled a critical one, right? And when they lose composure, I ask them, tell me how that manifests. What happens to your character because you lost this point of composure, right? Which is sort of like my insanity metric. I just don't call it insanity. I call it composure. And then, I put pictures in of like the cultists and things like that. There's a deep one. I found all these on like Pinterest. And then I had this whole page of like NPCs for hire. These are like the town council. And then I had like, these are the three people that I mentioned before. So, they're investigating Ned's murder. I mentioned that. They visited the cellar and the caverns. There was a fight in the council chamber. That was like my last session. So a lot of stuff happened, and I haven't like recapped it yet. So I was ready for them to board the Sea Ghost, but they have not done that yet. So the thing that happened in the last session was there was a fight in the town council chambers, and it was revealed that Lassiter was probably part of this cult, and he tried to deny it, but he'd made plans to escape, and so he had things in place. He'd cast some spells beforehand to get ready. And I had tried to make it very cinematic. I had a balcony where people could jump down. There was a raised platform with stairs. There were stained glass windows that could be shattered with a missile attack, including a spell. And then they had to save versus spells, or the colors were going to disorient them as this glass fell to the ground and shattered. And then they had to save versus breath weapon or take damage from falling glass, and then included the spectators. Okay. And then those are the NPCs for hire. And then I had some explosives at the entrance to the cave room that they, if they failed to find them to disarm the trap, then they would explode. So I try to put like different things like that again in place to make things a little bit more fun and cinematic rather than just like a standard council meeting. The fight broke out. And I, to be quite honest, at this point, I'm not quite remembering why and what happened, but I think it was that they had figured out who had killed Ned. And so they went to the council meeting, which again, they knew when it was going to be held because it was on one of these notes back here. They knew when the council meeting was going to be. And so then they went to go fight this guy and kind of bring him to justice. There was a chandelier in here that they could, it was precariously swinging almost loose. And then the D4 was that it was going to fall, but they could use it to strategically block the escape of Lassiter if they handled it correctly. So that's kind of where we're at with this group now. So as far as the Sea Ghosts, which is the second part of this adventure, and them getting onto the Sea Ghosts and taking it over, which is part of this adventure. The idea is that you can go on here and take over the Sea Ghost, and then you could have adventures on a ship. I don't know that they're going to do that. So they don't seem to be too interested in like figuring out why there was an opening and there was a boat, like a small little rowboat, like in the caves that clearly had come from a bigger ship. There are signals, there are lights that are out in the sea that people can see, and like they've got all these clues, and that's part of the adventure, is that it's signaling between the house and the ship of like when the ship can like bring the goods in. And that's what these lights are. All people see from town is they don't see that these lights are on a ship. They just see these blinking lights out in the middle of the sea. And it's a signal. The players haven't figured that out yet. So I'm not sure what's going to happen next. Right now, they seem to be, like I said, a little bit more concerned with what's going on with who killed Ned and with the town council and the cult. And that's totally fine. I'm trying to follow their lead in what they are interested in. So I'm not going to push them to do anything with the Sea Ghost, which is that ship, if they're not interested in doing that. But that's actually going to wrap up my kind of overview of the Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh. So I would love to know what you guys think about this adventure, if you've played it before, how you ran it, what you think of some of the changes that I made and how I handled it in my daughter's game. And, maybe hopefully some of you were inspired to try to do some stuff like that. If you were to ever run this again, maybe some of my descriptive words or, the atmospheric stuff that I talked about earlier, maybe that will help you, give you ideas at least of like how to kind of, change and add a little bit more descriptions, evocative descriptions to your DMing style when you're running a pre-published adventure. You can see how I kind of like, again, how I take the rooms that were in the adventure and I rewrite them and then I paste them into my book here and change them up to kind of make it fit a little bit more with my game. So I would love to hear your thoughts down below. Also down below, you'll find places where you can join me on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, etc. Link to my blog where I share content from time to time. And I would also like to once again thank all of my superfans who have contributed to the channel through the little, it's the icon of like the little heart with the $sign on it that you'll see on each video that you watch. That's a huge help. And I'm, again, just so thankful for all of you for showing your support of the channel and doing that. At a certain point, I've been talking about this, but I will have a Patreon where you'll be able to contribute and get like exclusive monthly content. But your support right now through that super thanks has just been overwhelmingly positive. And I really thank you all for your support on that. So that's going to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed it and let me know. And in the meantime, stay safe, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you next time. Now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So drinking wise, thought I'd do something a little different. This is, so I've heard a couple different ways to pronounce this. I think the sort of American anglicized version of this is Kikori, or Kikori. I've also heard Kikori, but this is, it says whiskey, product of Japan. Now what's interesting is that this is really like aged soju. So it's made with, or distilled from rice. And then it's aged in barrels for 3 years. I think they use like former bourbon barrels, if I remember correctly. But it's very different. I mean, it's made from a grain, so I guess technically it's whiskey, but it's very different from your average whiskey, your average American whiskey at least, or say English or Scottish or Irish whiskey. It's got this very, very pale light color. And on the nose, there's like this, I don't know. I want to say bubblegum. That's not the right word, but there's sort of like this artificial sweetness. And then it's like a tiny bit of lemon maybe, or some spice, but it's very, very faint. And then on the palate, yeah, it's very, very light in flavor and complexity. I'd say overall it's kind of more sweet than anything else, which is not normally something I'm looking for in a whiskey. I guess, as far as like a pro for this, it's smooth. So I bought this because years ago I was in Hawaii with my wife and daughter on vacation, and I went to a bar in Chinatown in Honolulu, and I had just a fabulous experience. I loved it. We had lunch there, and they had a cocktail on the menu that the name was in Japanese, and it translated to something like the Boulevard of, misbehaving boys, or I forget the exact name of it, but I guess it was named after a street in Japan where there are like boarding schools for young men, but they're located very close to the sort of seedier parts of town where young men could get in trouble with ladies or, maybe narcotics or booze. And so this drink was sort of named after that area, but because it was called the Boulevard of whatever, it was a riff on a Boulevardier, which is in itself sort of in the family of a Negroni. So, a Negroni is probably my favorite cocktail, but it's equal parts of gin, sweet vermouth, and Campari. And Boulevardier switches out the gin for whiskey, usually bourbon or rye. And so this drink had replaced all of the ingredients, but it kept within the formula, within the realm of using like a base spirit, and they used kikori. And then, to be honest, I wrote the recipe down. I don't remember what it was off the top of my head, but I wanted to recreate it at home. I'll put it in the show notes below because someone might want to make it. It was actually kind of fun. I quite enjoyed it, and I think that that's probably the best use for something like this, is using it in a cocktail as opposed to drinking it neat. Yeah, I can safely say it does not necessarily get better on the second sip, but it's fun to have. But I've had this bottle for probably about 7 or 8 years, and you can see it's about half full, maybe a little over. Okay. I just thought that would be fun to share because, again, I'm assuming a lot of you probably haven't had it before. So what I was listening to, I thought it would be fun to pull this one out because I did mention it in the intro, and I knew I was going to mention it, and so I thought I would go ahead and show it here. But this is Special Beat Service by, in the United States, we would call them the English Beat. If you were in the UK, they were just the Beat. But this is sort of, in that period where ska pop or pop ska, whatever you want to call it, was sort of, it had a minute, where it was really, really popular. So the Specials and Madness and, the Beat, obviously, and there were quite a few others. I have talked about a couple of them before, but this is 1982, came out in October, and one of the things that really helped this album a lot, so it has a few pretty popular songs on here. I think the two that most people know would be Save It for Later, and then well, for me it was I Confess. I quite liked that song a lot, but Save It for Later got a lot of play on early MTV, and so that kind of helped it. But this music was so important to me at the time because it was just so different from everything else that was being played on American radio. So it's like you heard this coming on the radio, and I had finally found a college radio station where I was living at the time that I was living, my dad had been transferred. I was living in Salt Lake City, which is where I discovered Dungeons and Dragons. But I finally discovered like sort of this, like I said, underground sort of college radio station that would play music like this that was not being played on the mainstream corporate stations that were just playing the same old, pop stuff. And so I really dug this. And again, I really liked, I was also, I took piano lessons from age 5 to about age 17, and I was pretty good. And I gave up because I didn't think that, I thought going into sports and playing soccer was going to be something that was going to help me get girls, to be quite blunt. And looking back, I realized that being able to sit down at a piano at a party or something would be so much cooler now. But I've not kept my skills up. But I really like this album because, like, I Confess has a piano solo in it. There's like certain songs like End of the Party. Another one has like a pretty long piano piece as part of the song. And I thought, like, how cool that it's this music that's very different, and it's not classical, and it's not like schmaltzy piano. It's like cool. And so I really dug this album, and I'm glad to have it on vinyl. Picked this up at the Record Parlor here in Hollywood, and it was in really good shape. I mean, you can see this is old. It's like, I can't remember if it's a first pressing or not. I put it in Discogs, and I don't remember now if it was a first pressing, but still, the sleeve is in great shape. Still has the original inner sleeve with the lyrics and stuff. Now the inner sleeve is split, so that's not great. And these aren't the best sleeves to hold it in. I need to replace the sleeve with a better inner sleeve. But I'm sure, again, if you're my age, this album, or you've at least heard it before. But I would encourage you to give it a listen again if it's been a while. I quite enjoyed putting this on. I hadn't listened to it for a little bit, and there was a time period I was dating a girl who was really into this kind of music. Later on, kind of like late 80s, early 90s, and she had all of their albums, and I remember recording them all onto cassette and just driving around listening to them all the time. So it was fun to revisit again. And so that's it. I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know in the comments if you like this album. Also, kudos to the folks last week, last video that I did on TSR's Oriental Adventures, I mentioned that I was listening to an album by Thelonious Monk, and I think at least 2, if not 3 of you picked up on the fact that Monk was in homage to the monk class from Oriental Adventures. So that was deliberate, and I didn't mention it when I said anything. I was just wondering if anybody would pick up on it, and a couple of you did. So kudos, cheers. And thanks again for watching. Make sure to check out some of these other videos, and I will talk to you next time.